Just sign here, Mrs. Whitmore, Chloe said softly, sliding the document across the polished oak table. And we can finally move forward without any confusion about who owns what. The conference room at Bennett and Rowe felt too cold for late September, the air conditioner humming steadily above the framed law degrees, and Eleanor Whitmore sat perfectly still at the end of the table, her gloved hands folded over her black leather purse, as if she were attending a church luncheon instead of a meeting about her late husband's estate. Daniel Whitmore, her only son, leaned back in his chair with a confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes, his tailored navy suit crisp, his watch catching the fluorescent light each time he checked the time, while Chloe offered a sympathetic smile that never touched her gaze. 2 weeks had passed since Charles Whitmore's funeral, 2 weeks since the casseroles stopped arriving and the sympathy cards slowed to a trickle, and in that short span of time the conversation in Eleanor's own home had shifted from condolences to logistics, from grief to assets. She had heard them whispering in the kitchen about capital gains taxes and the market value of the ranch outside Amarillo, about the downtown commercial building Charles had purchased 30 years earlier for less than $200,000, and that was now worth well over $2 million. And each time she had entered the room their voices softened, their expressions rearranged into concern. Now, in the lawyer's office overlooking Main Street, the performance continued. It's really just a formality, Daniel added, tapping the stack of papers with a manicured finger. Dad would have wanted everything streamlined. You don't need the burden of managing all this at your age. At your age? The phrase hung in the air longer than anyone intended. Eleanor, 72 years old and as composed as ever, glanced once at Mr. Howard Bennett, who stood near the window with a legal folder pressed to his chest, his expression unreadable. The late afternoon sun slanted across the table, illuminating the fine print of the document Chloe had positioned so carefully in front of her, and for a moment Eleanor allowed her eyes to rest on the signature line, the blank space waiting for her name. She remembered the same table in this office 3 years ago when Charles updated the estate plan, remembered the way he had squeezed her hand afterward and said, "No one moves you aside, Ellie. Not while I'm breathing." She had smiled then, believing it was simply a husband's reassurance. Across from her, Chloe cleared her throat gently. "We're just trying to protect what Dad built," she said, her tone almost tender. Protect. The word sounded noble, responsible, practical. Daniel nodded in agreement, as if this had been a collective decision made out of love rather than convenience. Outside the window, traffic rolled past in steady lines, ordinary life continuing without pause, and Eleanor felt a calm settle over her that surprised even herself. She reached forward, not for the pen, but for the document, lifting it with careful fingers and scanning the first page without haste. Daniel shifted in his seat. Chloe's smile tightened. Mr. Bennett adjusted his glasses. The silence stretched long enough to make Daniel tap his foot against the carpet. Finally, Eleanor lowered the papers back onto the table, her face serene, her voice steady when she spoke. "Of course," she said gently, as if agreeing to pass the salt at dinner, "if that's what you both want." Daniel exhaled in relief. Chloe's shoulders relaxed. Neither of them noticed the faintest hint of something else in Eleanor's eyes, something measured and deliberate. They believed she was surrendering. That was their first mistake. 48 hours before the meeting at Bennett and Rowe, Eleanor Whitmore had stood alone in the kitchen of the ranch house she had shared with Charles for 38 years, the early morning light spilling across the wide plank floors and the long granite counter that still smelled faintly of lemon polish. The house sat on 12 acres just outside Amarillo, surrounded by dry grass and a fence line that Charles had repaired himself every spring, and in the quiet after the funeral it felt larger than ever, as if the walls had pulled back and left her in the center of an echo. She moved slowly, not from weakness but from intention, setting the kettle on the stove and measuring loose-leaf tea into the porcelain pot she had received as a wedding gift in 1979. The routine grounded her. Water boiled. Steam rose. She poured carefully and waited, watching the seconds pass on the small clock above the sink. From the hallway, she could hear Daniel's voice, low and impatient, speaking to Chloe, in what he must have believed was a whisper. "The commercial property alone is worth more than we thought," he said. "If we restructure the management agreement, we can sell within 6 months." Chloe replied in a tone that sounded almost practical. She cannot handle it. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance. It is too much for someone her age. Eleanor did not flinch. She carried her tea to the dining room and sat beneath the chandelier Charles had installed himself, her gaze resting on the framed photograph of their 40th anniversary, the two of them smiling in front of the barn that had once needed a new roof and now stood solid and straight against the Texas sky. Later that afternoon, she walked down the hallway to Charles's study, a room Daniel had begun referring to as the office, as if it already belonged to him. She opened the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk and removed a small metal key taped discreetly to the underside, a habit Charles had formed years ago when he still trusted the world but not entirely the market. The key fit the safe behind the bookshelf, and inside rested a thick envelope marked in Charles's neat handwriting with a single word, Eleanor. She held it for a long moment before placing it into her purse without opening it. She already knew what it contained because she had been present for the revisions, had listened as Mr. Bennet explained contingencies and conditions, had nodded quietly while Charles insisted on language that was precise and deliberate. That evening at dinner, Daniel spoke openly about streamlining operations, about simplifying her life, about the comfort of a condominium in Dallas with an elevator and concierge services. Chloe smiled across the table and asked if Eleanor had ever considered assisted living communities with landscaped courtyards and organized activities. Eleanor sipped her tea and allowed the conversation to flow around her like distant traffic. She did not argue. She did not defend her competence. She simply observed the certainty in their voices, the assumption that ownership would transfer as naturally as seasons change. When she excused herself and stepped onto the back porch, the sun was setting over the pasture, casting long shadows across the fence posts Charles had painted the previous summer. She rested her hand on the railing and felt no panic, no confusion, only clarity. They believed the estate was a prize waiting to be claimed. They had not considered that every prize comes with rules, and that someone had already written them. The morning after Eleanor placed the envelope into her purse, she drove into town alone, her silver sedan moving steadily along the two-lane highway that cut through miles of flat Texas land. The radio turned off, the only sound the low hum of the engine and the wind pressing against the windows. She arrived at Bennett and Rowe just after 9 o'clock, before the front desk filled with clients and before Daniel could decide to accompany her under the guise of support. Mr. Howard Bennett greeted her personally, closing the door to his office with a quiet click that felt deliberate. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "I received your message," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "Are you certain you would like the final clause to remain exactly as drafted?" Eleanor removed the envelope from her purse and placed it in front of him, her movements calm, measured. "I am," she replied. "They have made it clear what they expect. I prefer clarity to confusion." Mr. Bennet studied her for a moment, perhaps searching for hesitation, but found none. He opened the folder on his desk and reviewed the documents once more, the pages rustling softly in the quiet office. "Once this is read," he continued, "there will be no partial acceptance. They must assume every obligation attached to the estate if they choose to inherit." Eleanor nodded. "I understand." Charles understood as well. The name lingered between them, not as a wound, but as a reminder of foresight. Mr. Bennet leaned back slightly. "Most families do not anticipate liabilities beyond visible assets," he said carefully. "Market fluctuations, pending tax reassessments, unresolved development permits. It can be overwhelming." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile. They have been very eager to take responsibility. When she left the office, the sky was wide and bright, the kind of clear blue that makes everything appear uncomplicated. She stopped at the bank on her way home and confirmed the transfer of certain personal accounts into a separate trust Charles had established years earlier, one that remained outside the primary estate structure. The banker recognized her immediately and treated her with the respectful familiarity reserved for long-standing clients, unaware of the quiet strategy unfolding beneath the surface. By the time she returned to the ranch house, Daniel and Chloe were seated at the kitchen island reviewing printed property valuations spread across the granite like a game board. Daniel looked up as she entered. "We were just talking about consolidating everything after the reading," he said casually. "It will simplify things for everyone." Chloe nodded, her expression gentle. We want you to relax, Eleanor. No more stress about tenants or maintenance crews. Eleanor placed her purse on the counter and removed her gloves, setting them neatly beside the sink. That sounds thoughtful, she replied. She moved to the refrigerator, retrieved a pitcher of iced tea, and poured 3 glasses, the ice clinking softly as she distributed them across the counter. Daniel took his glass without meeting her eyes. Chloe thanked her with practiced warmth. Eleanor observed them in the reflection of the stainless steel appliances, their confidence unshaken, their plans already unfolding in their minds. They believed the upcoming meeting would be a formality, a ceremonial transfer of control dressed in legal language. They did not see the difference between possession and responsibility. Eleanor understood that difference very well, and as she sipped her tea in the bright Texas kitchen, she felt no urgency to correct them. The afternoon before the reading, the ranch house felt unusually busy, though no one had raised their voice and no doors had been slammed. Daniel paced between the kitchen and the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, discussing potential listing prices for the commercial building downtown, his tone brisk and confident, as if ownership were already settled. Chloe sat at the dining table with a legal pad, making columns labeled sale projections and renovation estimates for the ranch property, occasionally glancing toward the hallway that led to Charles's study. Eleanor moved through the house quietly, dusting the mantel, straightening framed photographs, adjusting the lace runner on the dining table, as though preparing for company rather than an accounting of her husband's life. She paused in front of a photograph taken 20 years earlier, Daniel standing proudly beside Charles at the opening of their second storefront, both of them smiling beneath a banner that read Whitmore Hardware, established 1984. She remembered the long evenings when she balanced receipts at the kitchen table, remembered driving across town to meet contractors when Charles was out of state, remembered the year property taxes nearly doubled, and they refinanced the ranch to keep the business afloat. None of it had felt like a burden then. It had felt like partnership. From the living room, Daniel's voice drifted toward her. Once the estate clears, we can leverage the land for development, he said. There is no reason to sit on 12 acres this close to the highway. Chloe added something about demand for gated communities, her tone practical, forward-thinking. Eleanor set the photograph back in its place and walked toward Charles's study, closing the door behind her with gentle precision. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedar, the shelves lined with binders labeled by year, each one a record of calculated risks and careful decisions. She ran her hand along the edge of the desk and allowed herself one measured breath. Charles had never been reckless. He had invested in growth, yes, but always with safeguards, always with contingency plans that protected what they built from sudden shifts in the market or the economy. When he updated the estate documents 3 years earlier, he had insisted on including language that required accountability from anyone who stepped into his place. Inheritance is not a reward, he had told Mr. Bennet while Eleanor listened quietly. It is a responsibility. Outside the study door, Daniel laughed at something Chloe said, the sound bright and unaware. Eleanor opened the top drawer and removed a folder containing tax reassessment notices, outstanding infrastructure improvements required by the county, and a pending zoning review that could significantly alter the commercial property's valuation. She had reviewed each document with Mr. Bennet during her visit, confirming that all of it remained attached to the estate as written. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been exaggerated. It was simply the full picture, the part that required patience and diligence rather than celebration. When she returned to the kitchen, Daniel looked up. Everything is going to work out, he said reassuringly, as though speaking to a child. Chloe smiled in agreement. Eleanor poured herself a glass of water and met her son's eyes steadily. I am sure it will, she replied, her voice even and untroubled. They mistook her calm for compliance, her silence for surrender. They did not recognize it as preparation. The morning of the reading arrived with a pale gray sky stretching over Amarillo, the kind of sky that made everything appear suspended between seasons, and Eleanor Whitmore dressed with deliberate care, choosing a charcoal wool suit she had worn to Charles's retirement dinner and fastening a simple strand of pearls at her throat. She did not rush. She brewed her coffee, measured exactly 2 tablespoons into the filter as she had for decades, and stood at the kitchen window watching the wind move through the tall grass beyond the fence line. Daniel and Chloe entered the kitchen shortly after 8, both dressed in tailored business attire that suggested anticipation rather than mourning. Daniel checked his reflection in the microwave door while Chloe adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and offered Eleanor a reassuring smile. "This will bring closure," Chloe said gently. "It is time to move forward." Eleanor nodded once, lifting her mug with steady hands. "Yes," she replied, "it is." The drive into town passed in near silence. Daniel focused on traffic while Chloe scrolled through emails on her phone, occasionally mentioning projected figures under her breath. When they arrived at Bennett and Rowe, the receptionist greeted them with subdued professionalism and directed them to the conference room Eleanor had already come to know well. The long oak table gleamed beneath the overhead lights, and a neat stack of documents rested in front of each seat. Mr. Howard Bennett entered carrying a leather folder, his expression composed but attentive. "Thank you all for coming," he began, taking his place at the head of the table. Daniel leaned forward slightly, elbows resting near the documents, confidence radiating from the way he folded his hands. Chloe mirrored his posture, her gaze shifting between the papers and Eleanor's calm profile. Eleanor sat upright, her purse placed neatly at her feet, her gloved hands resting lightly in her lap. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat and began reading the will in a measured tone, detailing personal effects, charitable donations to the local high school scholarship fund, and modest bequests to longtime employees who had served the Whitmore businesses faithfully. Daniel listened with polite patience, Chloe nodding at appropriate intervals as if already envisioning the consolidation of what remained. The atmosphere felt orderly, procedural, almost anticlimactic, and for a moment it seemed as though everything would unfold exactly as Daniel and Chloe had expected. Eleanor's face revealed nothing beyond quiet attentiveness. She did not interrupt. She did not question. She simply listened as the words moved steadily toward the final pages, where the language shifted from sentimental to structural, from remembrance to obligation. Outside the large window, a delivery truck passed slowly along Main Street, its engine rumbling faintly beneath the steady cadence of Mr. Bennett's voice. Daniel tapped his finger once against the table, a small sign of impatience that did not escape Eleanor's notice. Chloe glanced briefly at him and then back at the document, her smile faint but present. They believed they were minutes away from confirmation, from the formal transfer of authority they had already rehearsed in private conversations. Eleanor adjusted her posture slightly and folded her hands together, her breathing even, her expression serene. She had no need to rush what was coming. The room felt still, expectant, as Mr. Bennett turned the final page and prepared to read the clause that would determine far more than ownership. Mr. Bennett adjusted his glasses and lowered his gaze to the final paragraph, his voice steady at first as he began to read the concluding clause that governed the distribution of the remaining estate. "All real property, commercial holdings, and associated assets shall transfer in equal shares to my legal heirs," he read, and Daniel's posture straightened with quiet satisfaction, while Chloe exhaled almost imperceptibly. The lawyer continued without pause. "Such transfer is conditional upon the heirs assuming full responsibility for all outstanding debts, tax reassessments, regulatory compliance costs, infrastructure improvements, pending zoning determinations, and any financial liabilities presently attached to said estate." His voice slowed slightly as he reached the final line. "Acceptance of any portion shall constitute acceptance of all obligations in their entirety, without exception." Silence settled over the conference room with unusual weight. Daniel's confident expression shifted first to confusion, then to calculation. Chloe's smile faded entirely, her eyes moving quickly across the printed page in front of her, as though she might find an alternate interpretation hidden between the lines. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat and added, "To clarify, the downtown commercial property is currently under review for structural code updates required by the city. Preliminary estimates indicate compliance costs in excess of $800,000. Additionally, the county has issued a reassessment notice on the ranch acreage that significantly increases annual property taxes beginning next fiscal year." Daniel blinked once, then again, as if adjusting to bright light. "That cannot be correct," he said, his voice no longer measured. "The property is worth several $1,000,000. Mr. Bennett nodded calmly. "Gross valuation and net position are not the same, Mr. Whitmore. The estate carries active obligations. Your father insisted that any successor understand the full scope of responsibility before assuming control. Chloe leaned forward, her tone careful but strained. Surely there is an option to decline specific liabilities while retaining primary assets. The lawyer shook his head gently. The clause is explicit. It was drafted to prevent selective acceptance. The heirs must either accept the estate in its entirety, including all associated costs, or formally decline it. The air in the room felt thinner now, the earlier anticipation replaced by a quiet reckoning. Daniel's hand rested flat against the table, fingers splayed, as he reread the clause himself. Eleanor remained composed at the far end of the table, her expression neither triumphant nor wounded, simply attentive. She had heard these words before in Mr. Bennet's office, had understood their implications without flinching. Daniel looked toward her at last, disbelief giving way to a sharper awareness. "You knew about this," he said, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating a fact. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Your father believed responsibility should follow ownership," she replied softly. There was no edge in her voice, no raised tone, only a quiet reminder of principles long established. Chloe glanced between them, her confidence unraveling into visible uncertainty. The documents that had seemed like confirmation only minutes earlier now appeared heavier, layered with consequences that required patience, capital, and sustained effort rather than immediate profit. Mr. Bennet folded his hands and waited, the final sentence lingering in the room like a measured echo. The inheritance had not disappeared. It had merely revealed its true weight. Daniel's chair scraped lightly against the hardwood floor as he leaned back, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent conference room. He removed his hand from the document as though it had grown unexpectedly warm and looked again at Mr. Bennet, searching for a softer interpretation. "There has to be a way to restructure this," he said carefully, his earlier certainty replaced with calculation. "If we accept the properties, we can refinance, offset some of the compliance costs, maybe bring in outside investors." Mr. Bennet folded his glasses and set them on the table, his voice measured and even. "You are free to pursue any lawful restructuring after formal acceptance, but the liabilities transfer immediately. The code compliance deadline is within 6 months. The county reassessment begins next quarter. The estate does not pause while you evaluate strategy." Chloe straightened in her seat, her composure wavering for the first time. "And if we decline?" she asked. "Then the estate remains under the existing trust provisions," Mr. Bennet replied. "As written, Mrs. Whitmore retains lifetime residency rights to the ranch and discretionary control over asset management through the secondary trust." Daniel's gaze shifted slowly toward his mother. "You still have control," he said, not quite accusing, not quite acknowledging. Eleanor met his eyes without tension. "Your father believed in preparation," she answered quietly. "He believed anyone who wanted everything should understand what everything includes." The words were not sharp, yet they landed with unmistakable clarity. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand across his jaw as he calculated figures in his mind. $800,000 in structural updates. Increased property taxes on 12 acres of prime land near a growing highway corridor. Ongoing tenant negotiations at the downtown building. What had seemed like an effortless expansion now resembled a long-term obligation requiring capital, patience, and sustained management. Chloe glanced at Daniel, her expression tight. "This changes the timeline," she murmured. "It changes the risk." Mr. Bennet waited without interruption, the documents resting neatly before him. Outside the window, the afternoon sun shifted slightly, casting a narrow band of light across the polished table and illuminating the final clause once more. Daniel's confidence did not return. Instead, a different awareness settled over him, one that recognized the gap between ambition and accountability. He looked again at his mother, really looked at her, as if seeing not just a 72-year-old widow but the woman who had balanced books, negotiated contracts, and stood beside Charles during every expansion and setback. "You were willing to sign," he said slowly. Eleanor inclined her head just slightly. "I was willing to give you exactly what you asked for." There was no triumph in her tone, only composure. Chloe lowered her eyes to the page, tracing the sentence that had altered the room's atmosphere. Ownership was still available. So was responsibility. The decision now rested entirely in Daniel's hands, and for the first time since the funeral, he understood that inheritance was not a prize to be claimed, but a weight to be carried. Eleanor remained seated, steady and unhurried, as the silence stretched once more, no longer heavy with anticipation, but filled instead with consequence. Daniel remained seated long after the silence settled, his fingers lightly gripping the edge of the oak table as though steadying himself against an unseen shift in balance. Chloe leaned closer to him, her voice lowered but urgent, whispering figures and timelines that sounded far less certain than they had earlier that morning. Mr. Bennet gathered the documents neatly, not pressing for an immediate answer, aware that decisions of this magnitude required more than pride. Eleanor watched her son with quiet attentiveness, not as an adversary, but as a mother observing a lesson unfold in real time. The polished confidence Daniel had carried into the room had softened into contemplation, his eyes no longer fixed on projected gains, but on columns of obligations that would demand sustained oversight. What happens if we take time to consider? Daniel asked finally, his tone measured. The estate remains intact under its current management, Mr. Bennet replied. You may review the full financial breakdown and consult independent advisors. The option to accept remains open, but the conditions do not change. Chloe straightened, her expression controlled yet strained. We need to review every detail, she said, her earlier enthusiasm replaced by caution. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket with deliberate calm. Take all the time you need, she said gently. Serious commitments deserve serious thought. Daniel looked up at her again, searching for irritation or triumph, but found neither. There was only steadiness. They exited the conference room together, the hallway quieter now than when they had entered. Outside on Main Street, traffic moved as it always had, indifferent to private reckonings unfolding behind office doors. Chloe walked slightly ahead, already on her phone scheduling a consultation with a financial analyst, her voice controlled but no longer bright. Daniel paused beside his mother before reaching the car. You could have told us, he said quietly. Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. I believed you understood what you were asking for, she replied. The words were not harsh. They were factual. Daniel nodded once, the weight of that understanding settling more fully. At the ranch later that afternoon, the house felt different from the day before. The conversation about rapid sales and streamlined transitions had vanished. Instead, Daniel sat at the kitchen island reviewing spreadsheets with a new seriousness, the glow of his laptop reflecting in eyes that no longer held easy assumptions. Chloe moved more slowly through the house, her confidence recalibrating as she absorbed the complexity of what inheritance truly required. Eleanor returned to the back porch as the sun dipped low over the 12 acres of land Charles had once called their responsibility before their reward. She rested her hands on the wooden railing, the breeze light against her face, and allowed herself a quiet breath. Nothing had been taken away. Nothing had been hidden. The estate remained exactly as Charles had left it, whole and demanding. The only change was perception. Inside, Daniel closed his laptop and stared at the numbers once more, aware now that ambition without preparation could become a burden rather than a blessing. Eleanor did not need to speak again. The lesson had already begun to settle, not through confrontation, but through clarity. 3 days after the reading, the ranch house settled into a quieter rhythm, the earlier urgency replaced by a thoughtful stillness that lingered in every room. Daniel had not rushed back to the attorney's office, nor had he contacted developers about immediate sales. Instead, he sat at the dining table each morning with printed reports spread carefully before him, reading through compliance summaries and tax projections with a focus that was new and deliberate. Chloe joined him, her tone less assertive, her questions more cautious as she began to grasp the scale of ongoing obligations tied to each asset. Eleanor moved through the house with the same steady pace she had always carried, brewing coffee, opening windows to let in the dry Texas air, checking the mail at the end of the gravel drive. Nothing about her routine signaled victory. There was no celebration, no pointed reminder of who had anticipated what. She had not set a trap. She had simply preserved the structure Charles believed in. Late one afternoon, Daniel stepped onto the back porch where Eleanor stood watching the horizon, the golden light stretching across 12 acres of land that had required decades of discipline to maintain. He paused beside her, his voice quieter than it had been in months. I underestimated it, he admitted, not looking at her at first. I saw the value but not the responsibility. Eleanor kept her gaze forward, her expression calm. Your father never measured success by what we owned, she said softly. He measured it by what we were willing to maintain. Daniel nodded slowly, the wind brushing against his jacket as he absorbed the words. I need time, he added. Time to decide whether I am prepared to carry all of it. Eleanor turned slightly toward him, her eyes steady and clear. Time is reasonable, she replied. Impulsiveness rarely is. Inside the house, Chloe closed her laptop and joined them on the porch, her earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful restraint. She no longer spoke about rapid transitions or effortless gains. Instead, she asked practical questions about tenant relationships and long-term zoning plans, her tone measured rather than triumphant. The estate had not diminished. It had simply revealed its full dimensions. That evening, as the sun dipped below the fence line and shadows lengthened across the pasture, Daniel spoke again. If we choose not to accept, will you continue managing it? Eleanor offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. I have been managing it for years, she answered. The statement was not a challenge. It was a reminder. Daniel inhaled slowly, understanding settling into place not as defeat, but as clarity. Ownership, he now realized, was not about entitlement. It was about endurance. Chloe glanced at him and then back at Eleanor, the tension that once defined her posture replaced by contemplation. No signatures were exchanged that night. No declarations were made. The decision remained open, balanced between ambition and accountability. Eleanor rested her hands on the porch railing and looked out over the land that had shaped her marriage, her family, and her resilience. They had wanted everything. Now they understood what everything truly required, and in that understanding, the balance had quietly shifted.